One of the secondary skills I picked up on the journey through seminary is that of packing a moving truck. When you move your entire household on a 26-foot yellow Penske truck a few times, you begin to exercise your spatial skills in my particular part of my engineering brain. And whenever I packed a truck, I had two particular sort of principles that I operated with. The first one is that no space goes unfilled. And there's a good reason for this, because if you don't have good spatial skills and you just see that little kind of pocket above the boxes way in the front part of the truck and just go, well, we'll keep working. Pretty soon you get to the back and you have like a whole dresser size of space that you have not filled, and then things that you can't get on the truck because you didn't fill all the spaces. But the other thing is, if you don't fill it all the way up, what happens when you go over a bump? Stuff goes all over, so you got to pack it in there tight. So no space goes unfilled was my first principle. And the second one was to work in layers. Because if you work in layers, you can tie down a layer and then get another layer in and tie that down to make sure the stuff is in there good and tight. Now, in my particular way of packing our household goods, we had those stackable plastic crates with the flip lids. We had just enough of those to make a whole layer. So all the way across the bottom, all the way up to the top. And then we would tie that in. So that layer was a pretty regular layer. Then there would be layers that might have like a coffee table, and then some boxes, and then some softer stuff, and then up on top maybe a flat clothes dryer or some kind of our household goods that would fit in those spaces. So it was still a layer, but it wasn't quite as uniform and regular. And then the last layer was always the stuff that just is weird, like bikes and a grill and a toolbox. And we used to have a lamp that was all kind of like a big old arm, and so that went on the back. Plants, different stuff like that all went on that last layer. But all of those layers then helped get the stuff in there with no space going unfilled so that we could bring it all with us. Our Bible stories today have a bit to teach us about prayer, and part of what I think they help us to wrestle with is that there are layers of prayer. And to wrestle with that a little bit, I have three questions for you. The first question is, what is prayer? Talking with God? Yep. Grandma said the same thing as grandson. What else? Is that all prayer is talking with God? Petitions? Yep. Listening?
Asking, of course.
Asking? So what that's saying is then there's different kinds of prayers, right? So to say what is prayer, part of it is it's conversation. That's a layer. But another layer is that there are sorts of prayers. So we might ask, we might give thanks, we might confess, we might listen, all of those things. Anything else that fits that, what is prayer? Thanking, yep. Another part of that layer. Do you ever just, you're just exasperated and you got nothing? Open, yep. So there's a posture that goes with it. So all in this, you can see that just in that, which seems like a simple question, what is prayer? So there's layers, right? There's kinds of prayer. There's postures of prayer. There's when you're talking about it, an openness is almost not a physical posture, but a heart posture about how it is we live into that space. So there's all these layers of what is prayer. So then the second question is, why do we pray?
Because it's pleasing to God.
It's pleasing to God. That's an excellent answer.
Helps us feel better.
Helps us feel better. Yep. Strengthens the relationship with God. Yep. To give thanks. That's always a good place to start. Do you ever pray because you don't have any other options? When I was at the Children's Hospital in Columbus as a chaplain, I had 2 floors. The outpatient surgery, which is where everyone came into the hospital for any kind of procedure. And I would go into those rooms and at the end of the visit say, would prayer be helpful? And, sometimes they would say, oh yeah, I guess sure. But often they would say, no, we're okay. I also had the pediatric intensive care unit. And the whole time I was there, I think one family said no. And they said no because they were doing plenty of praying. They didn't need me to pray for them. They were doing just fine in their own prayer. But all of them, right, when you're in the intensive care unit and the doctors aren't making progress and someone says, would prayer be helpful? At some point you're like, sure. Nothing else is working, right? And so there's layers here again. we got all these layers about what is prayer, but then we have these layers that why we pray. Sometimes it's for relationships, sometimes it's to feel better, sometimes it's because that's all we got left. And we're just trying to give it to God. And then that leads to the next question is, what do we expect is going to happen when we pray?
We'll get better. We'll be healed.
Healing? Okay.
Some kind of answer.
Some kind of answer.
You give it up.
You give it up. So you expect to be freed from it, maybe? Okay.
Turn it over.
Turn it over.
Get connected to God.
Get connected to God. That is always good, yes. So again, layers, right? And so one of the things we did talk about why we pray is for other people. So when we talk about healing, sometimes it's for us, sometimes it's for other people. But there's connection, there's healing, there's some kind of answer. And when we pray all of that, we're just sort of giving it up to God, so we maybe don't have to carry that on our own. Now, all of these layers of everything we have just said, I think, is a wonderful explanation of some of the layers of prayer. There are lots of layers, and we could probably spend hours unpacking all of them. And everything we have just said, I think, is true and wonderful about prayer, about this conversation that we have with God. Now, if I think about my own prayer life over the years, it looks a lot like the layers of that moving truck. Sometimes it has been like that last layer that's kind of random and odd shapes and not real intentional, just kind of trying to make it happen as I go. Other times it has looked like those layers that are kind of irregular. Like I'm trying to put some structure to it, but it doesn't necessarily always come in ways that I don't live well into the intention. Other times it has been like my wall of stackable crates, very orderly, very intentional, every bit of it right where it feels like it should be. And I could keep going and all of it, but the last question of what to expect to happen is the one that I think I have struggled with the most. And Steve, you said we expect some answer, right? And if I talk to enough of you about prayer over a period of time, I would bet that at some point you would say, well, we don't really know how God's going to answer our prayers, and it doesn't come on our time. And that is 100% true. We also might say that we pray for healing, but we really don't always know what that healing looks like. And that healing may look like the peace of death. That healing may not come until they get to that place of everlasting life with God. And the more that I think about how I have wrestled with that over time, I really think it comes down to I don't expect much to happen when I pray. And to say, well, I'll get some answer, I may not know what it looks like, is to say that I really don't have an expectation. I'm just hoping that God. It doesn't mean I don't have hope, but it does mean I maybe don't have a clear expectation. And I would bet that most of us have been in a place where someone is in need of real healing as they are headed towards probable death. And we may pray for healing, but are we really expecting that it's going to happen? Or have we kind of already dialed back and thought, well, I'll pray for healing, but maybe that healing will be something different. And I think we do this a lot more than we realize as we start to qualify what it is that we're expecting to happen when we pray. When I was an IT guy, we used to have to guess or predict how much it would cost for us to do a certain amount of work. And anytime a client asked us to do that, you would give them what you thought was the best answer, and the best answer was always too expensive. So then they would want you to dial it back to what was affordable. And I think that was a good place to be in because you have to wrestle with that. But sooner or later you get tired of putting together the best answer to get told, no, we're not going to pay for that, so you just skip to the other one. And I wonder how often we do that with prayer, where we could have this expectation, but we start to kind of dial it back to where we are in the conversation with God and we're praying and asking and saying thanks and doing all of those things that we have said are parts of the layers of prayer, but that in the end, do we really expect that God is going to show up in a way that we can see and in a way that is going to be understandable to us? And if we did, I don't think we would talk so much about saying, well, God will answer it sometime and we may not know what that looks like. Because that is then saying that I don't expect it to be anything that I can understand or see. And if we don't expect God is really going to show up in ways that we can understand, then it's up to who? Me, right? Then I'm letting it go, but am I really letting it go? Or am I continuing to work hard and try to save ourselves and take care of ourselves and do all of these things to where we don't really expect that God is going to do it? So all of that is not to say that our prayer lives and everything, these layers we've talked about are wrong, right? It's just to say that as we live into this, there's more layers. And that Jesus invites us more deeply into that. And those layers are in these two Bible stories today. Moses goes up the mountain to do what? Pray, right? It doesn't say pray. It says he goes up to talk to God. But Moses goes up, and when he comes back, there's something particular that he brings with him. And that is a word from the Lord. It doesn't tell us what Moses says, if he says anything, but he comes back with a whole bunch of things to tell the people that God has said. So he doesn't come back with healing. He doesn't come back with many of the things we often, and I think, should pray for. But he does come back with a word for the people. And that word is the law that is a gift to the people, and Moses shares all of that with them. So he comes back with a word. Jesus goes up on the mountain to do what? And what does he experience? Transfiguration, but he gets what from God? He also gets a word from God, right? It does not tell us that Jesus is saying anything. He's talking to Moses and Elijah, who are telling him about his upcoming departure, and then a cloud comes and God speaks. This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him. So they get a word from the Lord. Is this a word they asked for? No, the disciples were falling asleep. Right? They weren't even praying, and yet this word comes. Now, the second thing is happening in these stories. What happens to Moses' face? It shines. What happens to Jesus? He's transfigured. Both of them, in their prayer, are transformed. They are changed. So they go up the mountain, they pray, they get a word from God, and that word from God is part of this transformation that happens to them. Now, does that transformation stop with them? No. Moses comes back to a whole group of people who now have to deal with a guy that has a glowing face. And it's overwhelming for them, so Moses has to put on a veil. But in that, you can imagine that they could see the power of God, and they heard this word from the Lord, and they got this gift of the law, and it begins to work transformation in the whole community. Do you think Peter, James, and John were the same after they saw Jesus that way?
No.
Not a chance. Now, they may not have fully understood it right away. Maybe when Jesus was resurrected and everybody was going, this is crazy, they said, oh, well, you guys we weren't there that one day, right? So they're changed, no doubt, and it may take time for that to unfold. But then Jesus comes down the mountain, and there's a guy who's got a kid that's got a demon possessing him, and who can't fix it? The disciples. Now, if you pay attention to the narration, it's not the ones that were up with Jesus on the mountain, because right when they come down, they say, hey, your disciples couldn't fix this. So the disciples that weren't in prayer or weren't with Jesus at this time weren't able to get this done. Maybe they didn't expect it could actually happen. But then Jesus comes down the mountain, immediately casts out this demon, and the community around them is changed. So Jesus gets a word from God, Jesus is transformed, and that transformation impacts the community around him. Now, Jesus prays with other layers. Later on in the gospel stories, we will hear him go to the garden and say, I don't know if I want to do this, God. And on the cross he prays, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So Jesus also makes those requests of God and speaks to God in the ways that we do. And I wonder if it wasn't that transfiguration that allowed him to get through that time that got to the cross. I wonder if there wasn't some transformative aspect of that allowed him to then go to the cross. And yes, pray those prayers that he prayed, saying, I don't know if I want to do this, but still be able to do it because of what he had experienced with God saying, this is my son, the chosen. Listen to him. And in that way, then, Jesus' prayer that transformed him doesn't just stop with the disciples or the people that were there, but all of us, because that's through the death and the resurrection that we get this gift of life that we have been given. So they go up these mountains, Moses and Jesus, and they hear a word from the Lord. They are transformed by it, and the community around them is transformed. So if I ask you now, what should we expect to happen when we pray? What should we expect? Transformation, a word from the Lord, and that transformation will shape the community around us. That is not a layer that we think about all the time. Last week we had our assistant to the bishop, Pastor Rob Carlson, with us, and several other congregations gathered in this space. And our conversation was about how do we prayerfully discern where God is calling us as congregations. And his invitation to us is to put together a team of people. And if you would like to be on this team, please let me know. But the challenge for that team is to pray twice a day in contemplative prayer, which is listening, not speaking, just sitting and listening in silence, twice a day for 20 minutes for at least 90 days. Now, for some of you, that just probably sounds awful, trying to sit still for 20 minutes twice a day for 3 straight months, right? But they went up to the mountain. They did not necessarily speak. It was in that contemplative place of prayer that God spoke to them a word that transformed them, that then transformed the community. And Pastor Rob's invitation to us is to trust that that is actually what can happen. That if we, some number of us, take that time to sit and listen, to be in that place of silence, that God indeed will speak a word, that we will be transformed, and that that transformation will then impact the community around us. Now, as he was speaking to us, one of the things he said we needed to do was to tend to our practices of hospitality. The ways that we welcome people as they come in the door, we should be wearing name tags, all those other kind of the details of hospitality. And the reason he said we need to do that is because he said if you begin to pray in this way, people will start showing up. He didn't say they might. He didn't say it's a possibility. He's done this in congregations and worked with other congregations to do this, and he said anytime we stop and we begin to listen, who does it change? Transforms us and the community. So he said people will begin to show up, so you need to be ready for that. I have to tell you, some number of months ago, I don't remember how many, I started coming earlier in the morning on Sundays, and just sitting in here and listening. But before I listen, I ask God to make something happen here on Sundays and to bring transformation to us. But then I just sit and listen. So I do a little bit of talking. I got that layer, and then I bring the other layer and just sit in this space. And Pastor Rob has all kinds of stories about the way that those guests have come into the space once they started praying. And the stories are amazing. And I have some of those stories now too. From just sitting in this space and praying and expecting that maybe God is going to bring transformation among us and it's going to shape the community around us. I'm not going to share them all with you because they're not my stories to share. But I trust that as Pastor Rob invites us to do this as we go on this journey, it's not something that we're inventing, right? It's following in the footsteps of Moses and following in the footsteps of Jesus and trusting that all those layers of prayer that we pray are wonderful and that this is just another layer deeper. Which brings me back to the moving truck. When we got to Tampa, a group of men from the church came to help us unload, and they opened up the truck and they were like, oh my goodness, because they just saw all the random stuff. But then they got past that and found the semi-orderly layer, and then they finally got to the wall of stackable plastic crates, and they said, okay, we're done. And then the guy in the truck pulled a couple of them down, and you heard him go, oh, there's more. Well, behind that was the things I always put on the truck first, which were the dining room table, which was the layer that held up the things that were piled on top of the washing machine, the chest freezer, and the dryer. So if you think about those, the core part of that was a chest freezer, which is where you store, and a table, which you eat, food, and a washing machine, which cleans. So the beginning of packing of that whole truck started with food and cleansing. So all of the praying we do, all of those layers, every time we gather in this space, right at the beginning, like it's all layered on top of these two gifts of grace that we get. A table with food and this font that cleanses us. So whether we're speaking, whether we have terrible expectations, or whether we find places where we really truly can listen and hear a word from God, all of it starts in these places that already bring us transformation. And the rest of that transformation will come. We may not know what it's going to look like, but we can expect that it's going to happen because Jesus is in the transformation business. And when it happens to us, it will shape the community around us in ways that we cannot predict and maybe don't always understand, but will be blessed by as we go. Amen.